Broadcasting live from the dark web, this is the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, the film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender and horror. My name is Louisa, and I'm joined by my groupies,
Mila,
Tyia, and Zeba.
And this is our last episode for now, covering serial killers and horror. We're talking about the 2023 Canadian crime thriller Red Rooms, directed by Pascal Plante. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcasts app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
In this film, young model and hacker Kellyanne voluntarily attends the disturbing trial of Chevalier, who has been accused of brutally murdering 3 young girls, in what is known as an online red room, a corner of the dark web where murders are broadcast for the highest bidder. The prosecutor has 2 of the 3 murders on tape. The last video of his latest victim is missing. The killer is masked in the videos with only his eyes visible. Kellyanne meets groupie Clementine, who has spent her every last penny to hitchhike to the trial and proclaim Chevalier's innocence for the press. The pair form an odd bond, growing increasingly close until Clementine soon realizes that Kellyanne's interest in Chevalier and her own exploits on the dark web go far deeper than anyone could have imagined.
in August of 2024, I was lucky enough to be able to sit down over Zoom and do an interview with Pascal about the film. And we all really loved the film and wanted to put it into our serial killer theme episodes. We are really excited for you to hear it, and we asked some in-depth questions about some of the topics that we also wanted to discuss in the episode and get some perspective from the director and writer himself. And we will be intersplicing some of the interview moments within this episode so that you guys can hear some of it as well after we discuss certain points. We hope you enjoy.
Tu sais que c'est sa fête bientôt?
Dans 3 semaines, ouais.
Tu penses te laisser de faire un cadeau?
J'ai un petit mot à dire à ces groupies, celles qui hantent la salle d'audience à chaque jour. Ben, on vous voit.
Ludovic Chevalier est l'auteur de ces meurtres qu'il a filmés pour un auditoire prêt à payer pour voir ça en direct dans ce qu'on appelle des chambres rouges.
Tu l'entends de voir si on entend ça?
Non, on l'entend jamais.
Comment tu sais ça?
Obviously, none of us have been on the dark web, I'm presuming, but we have all experienced online culture in a much more sheltered and benign and totally morally sound way. And I thought, what are your memories of like online chat rooms, maybe gaming sites, etc., etc.?
Bro, those chat rooms, what the fuck was I doing on there? Like Omegle, IMVU, what the fuck? Disturbing proximity towards predators. Yeah, it was a lot, especially like video chatting with adults, I think was terrifying.
It wasn't also innocent as having a Club Penguin boyfriend, unfortunately.
I did that as well, Zeba.
You invite them over to your igloo, please. You do a little dance.
Do a little dance.
Yeah, they do little dances.
They dance.
Tyia knows.
It's definitely marked like our generation's psyche a little bit. I think that like early 2000s web culture, it was a lot. It was just sort of unfiltered. In a sense, I'm very glad it happened when it did. Now to be navigating the internet seems, as like a kid, seems completely overwhelming.
There was no concept of like what's online is forever, even if you're not like consciously being recorded, if that makes sense.
I don't know that everything that we did online is forever. I think now I would definitely agree with that, or even like as of like 2010-ish. But I think some of that stuff is gone. Like some of those websites are gone forever.
There's been like huge data losses. It's really scary. Like we're prioritizing recording history online and things are not being preserved. It's a terrifying like future for historical documentation and archiving. This is such a bum out catch up.
I don't know. I was like more like internet nostalgia, but the problem is the internet's a dark place. But I guess like the closest you did come to predators was literally when we were all like on Omegle.
I was not on Omegle.
Okay, well, my dumbass was, and I think like it's just funny. It was kind of what I was thinking about when watching this film as well, of like how we just like so readily encountered predators who might also be frequenting the dark web, you know, or at least like nowadays they have to go very underground, but in our generation of internet, it was quite surface level because yeah, who was policing it?
I don't think they have to go underground now at all. I think there's so many kids who are very accessible online, especially on things like TikTok, who post videos of themselves doing things into like Twitter chat rooms and TikTok lives and talk to people who are adults who are possibly predators. I think that accessibility is very much still there, if not more so, because social media is so easy to contact people and there's so many different like live functions in individual rooms and things like close friends functions to where like that access is still there. And Omegle is very much still a thing. Like people do so many YouTube videos about talking to strangers on there. So like I think the access may be even more easier now.
I think access to pornographic content's very accessible, but not, we're talking about like much darker content, like criminal content.
We used to have beheading videos on YouTube. Like, you used to be able to see bare snuff on like the surface internet.
I think you're right in the sense of like we have a target rich like hunting ground because everyone is so individually accessible. But yeah, I did kind of more mean like our potential to access that kind of content has become way more underground as opposed to, yeah, you're right, like beheading videos on YouTube. Although, you know, with war media, we see that on social media as well.
The Monstrous Feminine is on most podcast platforms, so please go spread the word. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week, is Bye Baby, who mentioned us on Reddit in a thread asking for podcast recommendations. They said, Scary Crit, a black horror podcast, and The Monstrous Feminine are two I listen to. I really enjoy hearing from the perspective of different people who love horror. Scary Crit has a very casual tone, and they talk about race in horror movies alongside their general thoughts. One of the hosts, Lauren, wrote her dissertation on representations of black people in horror. The Monstrous Feminine is hosted by all women, and they talk about gender in horror as well as generally looking at horror movies and their meanings. Thank you. This is a really, really sweet little plug in Reddit. Really happy to be put alongside another cool podcast. And thank you so much for shouting us out. That's very special. Describing us as all women, perhaps, is less accurate. Welcome, because I guess we do talk about like experiences being perceived and socialized as women. Friendly reminder that we are also on Patreon and Substack. You can find all of our links and information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps.
I think this movie is nice that we did in relation to two films that I think have like a lot of voyeurism within them. There's kind of like a direct contrast with Tenebrae and how much the voyeuristic elements are in it, and then with I Saw the Devil, how much we see the gore, and both of those things are sort of absent from this one. However, like Mila said, I think in the I Saw the Devil episode, we once again are sort of skipping the psychology of the serial killer and going on this quest to figure out why he did something, and instead this one is a full like 180, and we're seeing the trial from the perspective of two very different girls. One is who is sort of like your serial killer groupie who is really fascinated by the idea that this man is being framed and there are all these evil women out to get him. Interestingly, mirroring some recent trials that were aired on TV. And we also have Kellyanne, and her motives are a bit unclear throughout the movie. We know that she's very fascinated and she's really well read on the trial. She understands everything that's going on, but we don't really know exactly what her motives are. She's very nice to Clementine, but it's very obvious they have different motivations, because when Clementine is sort of countering her, saying, oh, the prosecutor's really stupid, she doesn't know what she's doing, Kellyanne will interject and say, no, she's won every case, she's very smart. Or when Clementine is saying, oh, these things can be edited, Kellyanne will counteract and say things like, well, no, those were her teeth with the braces still on. It tested back as her DNA. So there's an obvious parallel between them, that they are both curious about this. they have different motivations and sort of the obsession with serial killers, but the differences between them and their motivations, I think, make their interactions more interesting because we're seeing this trial and hearing about these horrific crimes through the eyes of two very different women who are also both outsiders in the scenario. So neither of them are related to any of the victims, neither are they personally connected to the murderer. So their outside perspective sort of adds in their ability to see things, I guess, more objectively. And I think that is a unique way to approach things, and that's what makes this film so fascinating. I think the perspective is very fresh, and the writing is really good because we don't necessarily have a ton of time with each character, especially with Clementine. We have more limited time with her than Kellyanne. But by the end of the movie, I think we have a very good characterization of the characters and understand them. We understand the motivations. And the film finishes, I think, very conclusively, which is nice because I think sometimes when you're doing like indie or more art housey horror, sometimes people think that leaving things very open ended or for interpretation are better. And I don't always agree with that stance.
I also really like this film and the kind of way it goes into tackling serial killers as a genre. I think there's been a lot of work and like so much media about dissecting the psychology of a killer, but not a lot about their followers or like why people, their supporters or their groupies and stuff. So I think this was a really interesting shift for that, and I just like that as like a way in to this kind of we say like subgenre of like thrillers and horror. I think it was a really unique perspective.
I agree. I think that like we probably don't need another film that like dissects a serial killer's motivations, or at least like centers them in their story so much. I think like we've just like overdone it, and it's instead become a way of feeding people's like morbid curiosities around why people commit these sort of acts of violence. Because if you're just consuming so much of that content, like if you're like binge watching documentaries on Netflix about different true crime atrocities, I don't think you're coming away from it with a sort of broader understanding of the human condition. I think that you are like in the end becoming more and more kind of like addicted and obsessed with the capacity for human evil. And I think that translates a lot into like narrative film, where we're kind of obsessed with like why people kill. Like, don't get me wrong, that's obviously a fucking fascinating line of discussion. Like, I'm not denying that, but it's more like when that crosses the line into something that's more exploitative and sensationalist. Also, sometimes they try to sort of humanize as a way to like attribute some kind of nuance or like emotional sort of layers in a way that I think is very dangerous. I guess that kind of like is a parallel towards like these groupies and how they see the humanity or the injustice. Like either they think they did it and had good reason to, or they think they're being wrongly accused. I think there's a weird kind of, I don't know how to speak about these women without like, I want to show some empathy and some like compassion, but also what the fuck? Because some of this delusion about these men, I wonder, it's funny because I really am way more like interested in like why they would be so invested in this man's redemption in their story versus like why a man would kill. Like that seems just like a lot more interesting to me. And to be honest, the film doesn't quite like it. I think it's very a personal narrative of two women who and their relationship to each other. I don't think it does like a broad deep dive into their psychology so much, which I think would be a huge task like anyway. So I liked that it felt very personal to them, those two. I think it's such a new perspective that I was sort of thrown, like we watched so many films about killers, and I think that in a way I was like unmoored by this like new psychology which I like can't fathom. I'm not saying I can fathom murdering people, but it's kind of more talked about that, I don't know, it's not as much as a shock to the system. Obviously not equating these two things, being a serial killer and being a groupie to a serial killer, but I think there's something very obviously gendered about it and weirdly aligned with fangirl culture in a way that is very uncomfortable, like the way that people ridicule fangirls. Like they're ridiculed in the film. I found it like a new and very insightful perspective to look at in serial killers and horror and psychological thrillers.
I think this was a really interesting twist on the courtroom drama as well. And I don't know, I really appreciated that setting for a lot of the like actually really high stakes moments to happen. It also had like elements of desktop horror, which I appreciated. But to Mila's point, I am somebody who really does not understand like the psychology of these real life groupies, especially when it's sexual in nature. Like there's the, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for him, or, whatever, believing them to be innocent or believing them to be like misunderstood. That is a very different motivation to me than like you're turned on by this violent killer. And I feel like that is a really big portion of it. Like the people who are like, oh, Ted Bundy so sexy, Jeffrey Dahmer so sexy. Like, no, they're not. I feel like I use my eyes to look and see, and there's something else going on psychologically with people who are attracted to them. And Clementine, at first she's sort of like this like bleeding heart, like, oh, big old empath, and that's why she's there. So I found the interview that she gives at the end where she's like, no, I was in love with him. That's like a very different emotion than what she's sort of like representing publicly the whole time. So I still find it quite confusing. I thought this was a really, really fascinating dissection of the ways that obsession can go. I still struggle with like the sexual and the romantic fanaticism. It's like beyond me.
This is a good time to kind of splice in the interview that Tyia did, because I think Pascal goes into the research he did and like why he chose Clementine and Kellyanne and groupies, serial killer groupies, as a kind of subject.
How much research did you do going into the film?
Lots of research and lots of depressing research. So far, I've always written my own screenplay, whether it's my short films, and this is my third feature film. And to protect myself in a way, like I try to write more about what obsesses me than about me, let's say. And so, but I fell down a rabbit hole of research. It was really during the pandemic, to be honest. Maybe because there were so many true crime shows just like popping up everywhere. I would watch true crime here and there, but not be overly into it. But I felt like it was unescapable in 2020, 2021. And I fell for a lot of them, a lot of documentaries, even down to podcasts and YouTube and all of that. So lots of research, and also lots of research about women mostly, but women who are obsessed about, it's kind of a simple question. Why is it that men kill? And why is it that a lot of women gravitate towards men that kill? Like, this is a very serious psychoanalytical question, which I don't have a super eloquent answer for it, even though I did lots of research. And so I started by researching the quote unquote, the groupies, the killer groupies, because when I was watching a documentary about a serial killer, there would always be these people roaming the courtrooms or being there, sitting by their side or having a billboard or I love you and all that. And I kept thinking that, where's the film about them? I want a film about them. Like, I'm sick of having another series about Ted Bundy. Like, we've done them. We've done enough of them. But I'm actually very curious about what their profiles are. And they are very complex profiles. And so that's why in the film, there's Kellyanne and Clementine, two characters that couldn't be more different. And I felt if only I can have a duo that feels extremely contrasty, it's almost like you create the illusion that there's a spectrum between them. So there are different profiles that could potentially exist between those two poles. So, but yeah, lots of research and lots of depressive research.
I think Wendy Ide kind of put it well, really briefly, in a kind of Guardian review. She says that like there's something rather unsavory about our collective fascination with true crime, and in particular serial killers, the need to unpick all the grisly details, the ferocious appetite for atrocity podcasts and series. It all holds up a mirror to a less than flattering aspect of society. She says that to intro her review of this film, and I think that's just interesting because I do think this film is through Kellyanne and Clementine holding up a mirror to like our morbid fascination. I just think that's all very interesting.
To be honest, yeah, I think I was just more interested in looking at them like individually in a sense, because they're there for the same reason, but then we have like obviously different personality types and perhaps like priorities in terms of why they're doing this. Like if Clementine was in love, I think that Kellyanne perhaps was like satisfying a bit of her own morbid fascination, but also like her ability to get onto the dark web and be like proficient in technology, I think created this like ease for her to become so like engrossed in that world that a lot of people don't really have access to. And I do think that like Clementine is portrayed with a lot of empathy, even when she's clearly supposed to be a frustrating character. Yeah, I just think it was like such an interesting focus. And like obviously the suspense of the film is around being unsure, like if Kellyanne is like how deep she is in it and like where her moral compass points. Yeah, I think it definitely plays with that. The expectation, perhaps, that I don't know, I guess we talked about, I'll catch up in the I Saw the Devil episode. We were talking about like how the serial killers we remembered from childhood were women because there's this like, it's understood that a woman committing those sort of acts is like even more unfathomable and a somehow like greater evil because of her like potential to be a mother. So how can you like enact violence against someone when you're supposed to be this safe and maternal role in society? But I think that instead these characters are not like female serial killers, they are like adjacent to the evil.
I know the serial killer groupies were huge on Tumblr back in the day when I was on there. Not that I was a part of those vlogs, because that just doesn't interest me. But I certainly remember there was like an overlap between some of the K-pop fans and like alt girls who loved Lana Del Rey and were like weirdly obsessed with random serial killers. But the Tumblr girlies were like very weird about it. Like I think they were writing fan fiction. They were like digging up old clips and posting photos and being like, "Look how hot he was back in the day. I bet he was innocent." Like it was wild, and they definitely still do that about newer serial killers and criminals, or even certain celebrities who had trials for their criminal offenses. We'll see like a huge uptick of people who are supporting these men, like Johnny Depp or Shia LaBeouf, out of nowhere. They will get like a gaggle of fangirls who will defend them. I'm not really sure what the impulse is. So I would actually like to see a documentary or something to really break down why that tends to happen, because I don't really think we see as much of it with like women serial killers or women in the media who are accused of crimes, with the exception of like the small messengers community on like TikTok who are obsessed with like Jodi Arias or some shit. But, like with the exception of that, I really don't think we really see the same sort of response. So I would be interested in seeing some documentaries that delve into that. I think this film is like maybe will be the first of many that sort of start to explore this angle, because honestly it's more interesting than doing the same tired analysis of serial killers.
I have a theory about the psychology. It's based in nothing but my observations. What the Tumblr girls used to say, they didn't like really give motivation, but I do think that there is something about being chosen. In like a Ted Bundy type scenario where he would like kill young beautiful women, they wanted to be the young beautiful woman that like got chosen. And that fed into like the delusional crush. And I do think it's interesting that in this movie the profile of the like kidnapped women or girls, really like children, who were worth the most on the black market were like the whitest, the youngest, the blue-eyed ones. And that is a profile for definitely for some serial killers, just like have a type, and there's some like weird crazy worm in the brain that gets in there about the like, it's like pick me to the extreme, like pick me to die. um I don't know, I haven't heard anybody like say like in a confessional type of way in their own words that that's what it's about, but that's what I think it's about in some instances.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's born from like some deep self-loathing and this idea that it's kind of, and this isn't exactly the same, but it kind of overlaps to like people who love like vampire lore a little bit of like the danger of like being chosen and victims and stuff. I just feel like in terms of like if we're talking about like internet, like Tumblr era, like almost romanticization of these types of things. I do think there is this kind of like perverse like validation that people get from that when they feel so deeply in self-loathing. And I think like Clementine and Kellyanne really act as like kind of follies of each other in that way. Like I don't see Kellyanne like I do wonder about her. I think Clementine is more overtly insecure, it seems, and more overtly like a sadder character to me in a way, or like more overtly sad with her emotions. And not to say that like Kellyanne is not equally like kind of sad in her own way through her behavior, but I do think that Clementine for me, yeah, does feel like more like surface with her emotions, particularly in that scene where she like calls in to that show, and you do see Kellyanne act in a way that's quite like tender to her and like sympathetic. But yeah, so I feel like we see Kellyanne, even as she herself is delusional, take pity on Clementine, who seems to be the more overtly, or at least at first, overtly like delusional character. And I think, yeah, and I think when she like cries after going on the game show, you really do see like how sensitive she is to like the world and criticism. So I definitely see the kind of self-loathing psychology coming into it there.
One of the things I asked Pascal about in the interview was if they had to do chemistry reads with Kellyanne and Clementine, and how did they go about casting for those roles, because they spend so much time together, and the way that the characters have this sort of weird chemistry in which it sort of goes from like annoyance to an understanding between the two of them, and then almost a sort of affection at some points is really crucial.
But it's a good question, chemistry test, because of course, yes, this is what I love doing so far in my feature and even my shorts. Like I always end up to have, I love to have duos of character, because I feel there's a lot of great films that have been made when you follow like very rigorously one character, but I feel I have the tendency to like when they reveal each other, when a duo of characters reveal each other out. And yes, we did do so casting separately. So Juliette Gariepi, who plays Kellyanne, Laurie Babin, who plays Clémentine, they are actresses, so professional actresses, not actresses that have done that have been overly exposed as of right now. Because in Quebec, we have some of these actors. There's a kind of a star system in Quebec, so the actors speaking in French, we can see them on TV, we can see them in other films and whatnot. But even within that small star system, they weren't necessarily like stars per se. They're just talented actresses that ended up being the most convincing in the audition process, and also when we did the chemistry. So they could get along fine, but be very contrasty. So that's what we wanted. It was especially hard to find the proper actress to play Clémentine, because it's really rare, because with a limited amount of screen time, we go from finding her annoying to wanting to hug her. I feel like this is what we wanted, at least. This is what I wanted. But we put people in, we judge people quickly in life and in movies, I feel. So if we find her annoying, it's very hard to do that 180 and eventually have the audience to care for her. And I think Laurie brought this humanity to the role, where yes, she's this naive, confused character that has all these funny theories and whatnot, and yet since she's being true to her feelings, and that yeah, we find that commendable, and we even want to maybe comfort her a bit. So yeah, Laurie was kind of a challenge, and then yes, did chemistry tests, it worked fine. And this is what we did for most of the lead roles. There are not actors that you've seen in 20 other films before.
But I thought it was interesting that she wanted to shield Clementine from seeing the videos and sort of tries to repeatedly talk her out of it. I don't get the vibe that they have a vast age difference, although I think Clementine is maybe like in her late teens or early 20s. But that sort of protectiveness that she has over her, I thought was really interesting. So I wanted to hear what you guys thought about it.
So tying into that, the scariest moment for me is when Kellyanne puts on the like schoolgirl outfit and the wig in the courtroom. I don't know, it was just so deeply unsettling to me, and I think that is when my moment of recognition kind of clicked about the like what might be motivating her. And I still don't think I really get it, but one of my theories is that it is this like really, really sick, perverted pick-meism, and that is what her connection to Clementine's thing is. Like on the one hand, it is revenge motivated because she does give the police the tape that, you know, gets him locked away. But on the other hand, I think she like empathizes with Clementine's like love, not in the like the reasons that they are obsessed with this case are motivated differently. But I think that they share this like the obsession, the fixation. This is what makes me think of like the chemistry test, is that they had such different energy. Like Clementine was so like frantic and like kind of hyperactive, and she talked really fast and she had a lot of thoughts and she was feeling at really extreme levels. And then Kellyanne was just like controlled, measured. Like the poker is really interesting, like having literally a poker face all the time until she snaps. Obviously, like she has some sort of mentee B for sure. I thought that was a very cool scene of her like in the auction and doing the poker at the same time, like on the multiple monitors. Like she's still a really, really controlled person, even when, and she has a sort of like speech about like, oh, the worst players are like the ones who get emotional about it. And it's really like fun to take them out. Even at her, you know, she's been, you know, fired from her modeling gigs and her life is falling apart. Like even at that extreme moment, she still has enough like control to win the auction. And that's because she's like singularly motivated, but like they could not be more different. But I do think that they have this like in their Venn diagram, the thing in common is the like obsession with the killer.
I kind of like disagree that she was in control in that moment where she's playing poker and in the auction for the video. I think that that's showing her as kind of losing her shit because she's so invested in getting the video. You see how much it means to her, and she gambles in poker. Like she clearly like plays a really risky hand, and it works out fine for her in the end. But I think it was an example of her finally letting it slip. Like you said, she is going through like a bit of a mentee B, like things are unraveling, but I think it's her at her most unraveled in contrast to her very calculated life that she'd been leading. I think it did relate her more and more to Clementine. Like you said, there's like such distinction between them, but actually they have these sort of like desperations to be involved in the case, to be noticed, and that's like where they merge and like meet in the middle in a sort of more like psychological sense.
One of the points in this film, I don't think I necessarily touched on this in the interview, that I thought was quite interesting is Clementine's obsession and how it relates to parasocial relationships that people form. This is something that I think is particularly timely because we've had like Chapel Roan recently speak out about how parasocial relationships have been really frightening, and she doesn't want people to call her by her real name or touch her or approach her in public because it's very scary because you are a stranger to her. So seeing something like this on screen and seeing like the extremes and sort of the mindset of someone who is convinced in their mind that they know this person, because initially when the film starts, I thought maybe Clementine was his girlfriend who was supporting him at the trial because she was speaking in such facts. Like, he has never hurt a fly. He would never do anything. He's so nice. Like, you don't know him. Look at his eyes. They're sad because he's being tortured, and saying things like that. And I was like, oh, she must know him. Like, she clearly has some sort of in-depth knowledge, only for her to be a random who hitchhiked there and risked her own safety so she could support this man who does not know she exists. And that sort of devotion and what it triggers is really interesting in a horror film. I feel like I could watch a film just on how scary parasocial relationships are, because there's something I think so terrifying about blind devotion. It's sort of the same thing that fascinates us when we watch cult horror films, and we're confused and on how people have this blind devotion to someone where they're doing things that are risky or scary and the alarm bells just don't seem to be ringing. And she's listening to these horrific things that he's done to girls who aren't much younger than her. And she even sort of seems envious at one point that she maybe isn't the profile that the killer would go for, it almost as if she has like a suspicion, because she says to Kellyanne, like, oh, if your hair was blonde, you would be his exact type. And then she says like something about her hair's curly and Kellyanne's tall and beautiful and all these things. And sort of like what Zeba was saying earlier, like it really is sort of this ultimate pick me game that is terrifying to watch, and to imagine that people would have such extreme desire to be noticed or wanted by someone who they shouldn't even care about at all, besides hating them or feeling unsavory feelings. And so I thought that point was something that I would love to see explored more in horror. I think it'll be a much better use of horror films than it was when we had that weird era where everybody tried to remake Get Out. Instead, everyone go try to make a parasocial horror film.
Well, I think I know the answer, but did y'all feel better about only hearing the violence as opposed to seeing it? Because obviously it's making a commentary on how exploitative all media on serial killers can be. I guess I appreciated that they made that choice. And I did still find it quite scary in concept. Like, I find the dark web to be a really scary concept. I thought that, you know, what we do get to hear and what's implied is really scary, and leaving it up to our imagination is really horrifying.
I agree. I think I was like grateful for that choice to not show any of the violence. I think it still had like a very like visceral effect on me just to hear sound. Like, I always find sound to be the most evocative sense in horror versus if you just see something. So yeah, I think that's a more impactful choice to really convey like the utter horror and like suffering and pain that those teenagers were subjected to. I think also, like you mentioned, how you found the courtroom scene where she like puts on the blonde wig and dresses up in the uniform, and then we get that moment where they lock eyes, Kellyanne and the accused killer, and then it's just like screaming starts happening, which I think like is a really difficult device to pull off, like just random screaming, like non-diegetic screaming to happen in a film. Like, I don't know how many tests they did, like different volumes of the scream, different types of scream, to always get a close-up visual of somebody watching something horrific. I think also is very like a sort of creative way to evoke a sense of horror without showing images that it's hard not to be exploitative if it's like young girls.
This is actually something that I asked about in the interview, because I thought I wouldn't want to have seen those scenes, because who really wants to see like a 13-year-old being sliced up and tortured? That would be a bit much, even for a horror film. That's not something I would sign up for. But I do think this is the first time that I've heard screaming in a horror film where I've actually had to mute the sound while it's happening, because it just was like making me so emotional, and I felt so sick hearing it, because I think the image that you conjure in your mind can almost be worse, because we have like the description of what was left of her in the courtroom, and we know some of the things that happened, and like imagining it and thinking about the emotional parts of it. You see the picture of the girl like several times. We pretty much only see their pictures.
Yes, we don't see the footage, but we see something, and we see their faces. And to me, the film is more about that, quite simply. There's kind of two sides to that answer. So that's one side. To me, like the image we even use a lot during the promo of the film is just the image of the two women looking at the computer screen. One of them is in tearing up and being very almost traumatized, and the other feels like oddly icily enjoying it. And to me, that contrast is very much where the film lies. So yeah, I just felt this is way more interesting than having a 13-year-old being torn to pieces. This is one. But the other is, to be honest, is also because I tried to come up with something that can haunt the audience, that hopefully sticks with people, that hopefully. So I thought a lot about what are films that did that to me, and a lot of the times the films that did that to me are films that in very strategic places, they either didn't show everything or they shrouded it in a sense of mystery. And then what keeps you thinking is you still try to solve some kind of riddle after the film finishes, right? So not showing it, I also feel if you conjure up the images in your brain, it's much harder to push them away. Images you self conjured up, it's you almost have to live with them even more in many ways. So that's kind of that weird curse that I'm trying to cast also on the audience. Not being sadistic in the process. I think I'm trying to say something with this in the sense that, like, why are we bloodthirsty when we look at that kind of a thriller? Like, why did we want to maybe see the videos? Why are we rooting for an anti-hero who gets a kick out of watching these videos? Like, those are very valid questions. But then sometimes if you remove one of the senses, you overstimulate the other senses, and it creates something even more potent. I felt, at least. I also listen to lots of podcasts, and maybe it's because I'm more literate watching films and analyzing films. But then, just like if you have a good storyteller telling you a creepy story, I felt sometimes I would feel way more anguished than 95% plus of horror films that I was watching. So I also tried to get into that almost horror podcast logic.
Katie Rife for Roger Ebert talked about the actress who plays Kellyanne's performance as well, and says, as she coolly watches both in the courtroom and on the monitors in her apartment where Kellyanne researches the case in the dark web, because her performance is so controlled, small movements reveal much about the character's intentions and emotions, such as they are. Her gaze doesn't judge the viewer, but it doesn't absolve them either, and her icy inscrutability makes her a fascinating angle into a case that's nothing but prurient interest, her dead eyes and blank expression a canvas onto which the viewer can project their feelings about snuff films, sadism, and the bottomless depths of human depravity.
I think it's like, as a character, she reads as very strange from the beginning, so the viewer is very interested in seeing what her motives are, and maybe throughout the film, sort of like there's different points, and maybe you think she's like Clementine, or maybe you think she's in this because she wants justice, or maybe you think she is doing this for other reasons. But I think by the end, it sort of becomes more clear that this is sort of like a large poker game for her, and she's not really a person who is working by a certain moral code. She just enjoys the payoff at the end of a poker game. Like, she has money, but she doesn't seemingly care about money because she's also fine sleeping on the streets, and she doesn't really indulge in delicious foods or even good foods that are healthy. She like survives off of the absolute bare minimum. And her only thrill in like playing poker is like watching the other person lose everything. I mean, she had to be allowed into the bidding, and they had to feel like she was a trustworthy enough person to let in. So like the performance was for them so they could feel like she was one of them and she enjoyed this thing.
I do really like the point about like it all being a poker game. There was one reviewer, Benoit for Dead and Folies, who talks about how, and it's kind of similar to that movie we did, We're All Going to the World Fair, when we talked about like the kind of loneliness of internet culture. Anyway, this reviewer talks about like how Kellyanne seems like a very lonely character, and that's reflected by those kind of cool isolated shots where you're just like seeing the screen reflect across her face. Not that she's like sympathetic. I think you're right, Tyia, that the fascination with Kellyanne is that she's strange and you're trying to understand what her motivations are. But the director, this person says, creates a vacuum of loneliness around his protagonist, which she uses the web to fend off. Aesthetic details in this movie have an overbearing importance since it's so cold and surgical. For example, the sound of Kellyanne's shoes squeaking against the floor while she's training at home alone is a powerful marker of her loneliness. The overpowering sound of her keyboard, too. Loneliness is often defined by the sounds you don't hear when you're with people. I thought that was a really interesting point. And then it comes back to the poker point because, or poker, this is all just a poker game, or it's all maybe about control, because the reviewer goes on to say, that brings us to Kellyanne's relationship to the internet, which she uses to control her environment and overstep physical boundaries like locked doors or areas under surveillance. She uses it to shape her physical existence. Only at one point in the movie does she seem to lose control of herself, which is where she needs to accept that she'll have to sacrifice a part of her life to get what she wants. She's such a fascinating character. I just thought that was a really good point, and I think it ties in what we were saying, Tyia. I think that the internet provides some escape from loneliness of her actual daily life, which Clementine briefly provides as well, until she gets too disturbed by Kellyanne. But also it provides her with a sense of control, like the poker game. Like, she has a lot of power that she wouldn't necessarily have in real life. So yeah, it's all just kind of interesting. But viewing her like that, of like a person who's robbed of agency, does help me place her motivations better. Because if Clementine, is about like a kind of obvious self-loathing and like a more pick-me angle, then Kellyanne seems to be about maybe feeling overlooked in society and wanting more power or something. Especially seeing as she then goes and inserts herself into the investigation by like submitting the evidence and getting him convicted. So yeah, I think that kind of differing motivations is quite interesting, and I hadn't really twigged on it until you just said the thing about the poker game. There was also a really interesting reference that was identified by Damon Wise for Deadline. They talk about how Kellyanne's online handle is Lady of Shalott, which is a reference to Tennyson's poem about a woman in Arthurian times who was cursed so that she might only see the outside world reflected in a mirror. And this reviewer says Kellyanne's mirror is the dark web. So I just thought that was also an interesting thing of like what parallels are there, because I think you are kind of questioning how much she identifies with the killer and if he's like a mirror to her even as you're watching the film.
Thank you again, Pascal, for letting us interview you and having a conversation with me. It was really nice meeting you. We're so thankful for you. And Kayla, thank you for helping to arrange the interview. Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at The MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at The Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Brooms up, witches out.